I Do Exist is the story of five people who have really an interesting story to tell of change in their lives. Many people think of homosexuality as being, in a sense, a fixed condition, perhaps inborn. And many of the people, if not all of them, on this video that I interviewed, they thought that way too at one time. They thought that they were born gay. But then they made a change in their lives that many people in my profession of psychology and counseling say is impossible. They went from gay to straight, from exclusively homosexual to being exclusively heterosexual. Now, not all people describe that story of that complete change, but I thought it would be interesting to chronicle the story of these individuals because it's a story not often heard. I'm a counselor and as well as being associate professor of psychology, and at that time I owned a private practice in counseling, and that was the primary thing that I did. And I had a number of individuals come to me with dissatisfaction with their same-sex attractions. They wanted to experience change. They didn't feel that it fit their lives. They didn't feel it fit their religious beliefs. And so I did work with them and saw much change in many people. And about that time, professional associations were entertaining proposals that such work with people would be unethical. And I knew that there was effectiveness there. I knew that people found benefit in the work that I had done with them. And so I did a major literature review in professional work that's basically a review of all of the studies on a certain topic. And I did that concerning sexual orientation change and found that there were quite a few studies that showed change of various degrees with people who were once identified as homosexual who wanted to affirm a heterosexual identity. So I published that report in a peer-reviewed journal, and then again in 2002 published another report of an update of those kinds of studies. And so increasingly I became interested in the lives of people who were making changes and doing things that professional societies such as my own were saying were not even possible. In some cases saying they didn't exist. There's one research report from a man named Joseph Wolpe who basically didn't do any aversive counseling. He did assertiveness training. And he found a young person that came into his office and said, I want to be straight. And he told him, I don't think you can be. I don't think it's possible. So they went through a course of assertiveness training to work on some other types of problems. Well, lo and behold, in a few months, the man came back and said, you know what? I'm not attracted to men anymore. In fact, I've been dating a girl, and pretty soon we're going to be married. And this giant in the field of psychology couldn't understand what had happened. And so he wrote about this very humbly, saying, you know, I think I overestimated or underestimated the potential for human change here. As I look at the issue of whether homosexuality is a disorder or not, that many people still, talk about, what occurs to me is that it's only been for about 100 years in our history that homosexuality was even considered a disorder, since about the 1860s. Prior to that, homosexual behavior was considered, in a sense, a moral question. And so I'm not so sure that with the change of that occurred in 1973, that it was altogether a political issue. I think one of the things that was happening at the very same time that truly homosexual activists were lobbying strongly the American Psychiatric Association to make this change is that the way mental disorders were defined was being changed. Many people don't understand that the way that disorders were defined prior to when Robert Spitzer came on the scene in the early 70s was based upon a theoretical perspective of psychoanalysis, more of a Freudian view. And that view basically said that we know what your problem is before you ever tell us about your life, because Freud essentially theorized that all neuroses and problems derived from bad experiences before you were 6 years old. with your parents. And maybe not even bad experiences, but just the way you perceived your parents before you were 6 set your life course. And so disorders were based upon that kind of a theoretical foundation. Psychiatry moved away from Freudian psychoanalysis starting in the 60s and 70s. And so many disorders are now, in a sense, defined by their symptoms and not by what might have caused them. And that's kind of why homosexuality was in there in the first place, because it was assumed that homosexuals were, in a sense, produced by poor upbringing, bad family situations, and that's why it should be there in the DSM, the statistical manual for diagnoses in the first place. So as psychiatry moved away from a theoretical foundation for disorders and toward a behavioral one, they started looking at, well, are people upset or unhappy by their issue, whatever the issue is? Does it prevent them from living a well-adjusted life? And certainly in some cases that would be true of people who struggle with same-sex attraction. But for others it might not be. And so homosexuality just per se was taken out. But one thing many people don't realize, in the current list of disorders is something called sexual disorder not otherwise specified, which basically is a general category for sexual disorder. And one of the criteria for that disorder is persistent and marked distress over sexual orientation. There's still, in a sense, a reason somebody might consult a counselor if they're experiencing that. There is a presupposition on the part of individuals who oppose all efforts to counsel with people who are dissatisfied or in distress about their sexuality, that this distress has only one cause, and that is some kind of social pressure. Instead of actually talking to people and finding out what their situation is, why they're dissatisfied or distressed, many gay affirming counselors won't do that. They will simply say, you're born that way and there's nothing you can do about it. The individuals in the video, I Do Exist, a couple of them tell stories just like that they were basically told by their counselors before the counselors even got to know them and know their background, that they were born that way and there was nothing they could do about it. The list of disorders that I've been referring to that psychiatrists uses is a comprehensive list, and it does still include pedophilia. And yet there is, in a sense, kind of a loophole in there that some people are quite concerned about, that says that it's only a disorder if the person's unhappy about it, or if it causes them distress, or if it's a barrier to their occupation or their life success. Well, you know, that is going much farther on the value neutrality issue than many people are prepared to go.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
There's been a whole host of approaches to demonstrating a biological influence. Let me separate two things too: influence and determination. Often the press reports studies that may show a genetic influence or association to homosexual feelings and calls that determinism. And that's a big mistake that a lot of people make. But the public can be forgiven for thinking we're one study away from finding the gay gene because of the way the media reports this, but also the way that some of these researchers talk about their own work. Dean Hamer is an individual who first came on the scene advancing the gay gene theory. He claimed that he found a place on the genome that linked up very strongly with homosexuality. Unfortunately for him and that theory, that study has not been replicated. Even the most recent attempt to replicate it just this past March was not successful. The researcher in that case was a colleague of Dr. Hamer, and said that, well, there's probably not one gay gene, there's probably several places on the human genome that would associate with homosexuality. It counted 3 places. The problem was that none of those locations on the genome met the criteria for statistical significance, and yet the media reported in the press that 3 places now, there were 3 genes, not just one, that would relate to sexual orientation development. Dr. LeVay initially in the early 90s took a look at hypothalamus size in gay men versus straight men and found that there was a difference in a certain portion, certain area of hypothalamus. There are many problems with that particular work. Basically what he was trying to show is that there are differences between the brains of gay men and straight men in an area of the brain that would influence sexual feelings. Now, this study's been widely criticized and is also unreplicated. A team of William Bine and I think it's Bruce Parsons took a look at that study and found some very, very meager differences between the brains of gay men and straight men that they analyzed, but no difference in size of the hypothalamus. There have been other attempts to look at brain differences, but in one recent study, a Swedish study, did find that gay men reacted differently than straight men via CAT scans analysis in the hypothalamic area to smells of men. And so there is some probable differences in the way that gay men and straight men may react to certain stimuli, but really that's not a very surprising finding. What is at issue is how did they get that way? And the Swedish authors were very clear that that study said nothing about how those men got that way. They were all sexual experienced. Sexual response is highly responsive to learning, as is smell. And so the study authors said, we don't know how those brains got the way they did. It's very likely that they could have learned and shaped their brain. We know from research on the brain that it's much more plastic than we thought 20 years ago. And so brain changes do occur because of experience. And so any changes that you find in adult brains say nothing about how those changes got that way. Well, there have been several studies of cohorts, groups of identical twins. Michael Bailey from Northwestern is most closely associated with that research. He initially found through researching twins in this country through volunteers that about 48 to 52% of twins shared homosexuality with their identical twin. However, he did another study, follow-up, on an Australian sample of a group of twins that was much better collected. He even said so in his study that this sample, this cohort's much better research work, and found only 20 to 24%, 20% of men and 24% of women shared a concordance on homosexuality, which means there's a great deal of discordance on sexual orientation when it comes to identical twins. And so he said in his study that essentially there's no relationship between twins and sexual orientation. And again, many people don't realize that. Many people are still quoting the 50% study, and yet this new study is much better designed, and it shows a much lower concordance, and the researchers in that study said that there's basically no relationship. There's something else going on when it comes to the development of same-sex feelings and subsequent gay identity. There is and the researchers said this in this study, that there's pretty clearly what are called non-shared environmental factors, meaning that among twins, family can't be all there is to it either. That there have to be some things that individual twins go through in the environment that lead them then to experience something different sexually than their twin did. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment, that environment plays a considerable role, but it can be different for different people. You can't really say there's one type of environment that's the ground for all same-sex attraction, and I think that's what that study does support.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone.